When the empath finally opens their eyes to the hidden theater in which they have been cast as both healer and victim, something extraordinary occurs. The veil of innocence tears, and the secret order of psychic exchange becomes visible. It is a revelation not unlike a dream in which the familiar house suddenly reveals an unknown door, leading into subterranean chambers filled with ancient symbols. Long neglected, what was once unconscious erupts into awareness, and the very ground beneath one's being trembles. For the empath, this moment is terrifying and liberating all at once, for the game that has long been played in shadows now stands revealed in the glaring light of consciousness. The narcissist, whose survival depends upon disguise and projection, thrives only so long as the other remains asleep within the enchantment. Their craft is illusion. They weave a subtle web, persuading the sensitive soul that love must be earned by sacrifice, that harmony must be maintained by silence, that value is bestowed only through service to another's fragile ego. The empath, compelled by a deep archetypal instinct to heal and unite, is drawn into this orbit, believing themselves to be savior, when in truth they are prisoner. This is not merely personal pathology, it is an archetypal drama as old as myth itself, echoing in the stories of gods and mortals, of tricksters and innocents, of the predator and the lamb. When the empath sees it, the recognition is like an electric current running through the psyche. The truth cannot be unseen, and the dynamics of power shudder. I once observed in my studies of the unconscious that the human being is not merely an individual, but also the bearer of ancient patterns, the archetypes that guide, seduce, and torment us. The empath and the narcissist are not simply two people locked in unfortunate entanglement. They are actors compelled by archetypal forces that seek realization in flesh and blood. The empath embodies the archetype of the wounded healer, compelled to mend the suffering of others, often at the expense of their own life force. The narcissist channels the archetype of the devouring shadow, appearing first as lover, mentor, or charismatic guide, but eventually consuming the vitality of the other in order to avoid facing the abyss within themselves. These roles exist in all of us, in potential, yet some are caught more fully in their grip. Why, then, does the narcissist panic when the empath sees the game? Because awareness dissolves the enchantment. The narcissist's power depends not upon brute force, but upon psychic sleight of hand. They survive by implanting projections into the other. You are unworthy without me. You cannot trust your perception. Your light exists only to illuminate my darkness. When the empath awakens and reclaims these projections, suddenly the narcissist is left face to face with their own void. Stripped of the mirror that once reflected an image of superiority, to stand unreflected is unbearable for the narcissistic psyche, for their entire identity is scaffolded on others' perception. Thus they panic, not because they have lost the empath, but because they are now forced to glimpse their own shadow without disguise. Imagine, for a moment, a dream in which you are walking through a carnival of mirrors. Each reflection distorts you, stretching or shrinking, multiplying your form endlessly. You forget what you truly look like, for every image convinces you that this is who you are. Now picture suddenly finding a clear mirror at the end of the corridor, one that shows you as you actually are: vulnerable, uncertain, incomplete. The shock is nearly unbearable. This is the experience of the narcissist. When the empath stops playing the mirror game, the carnival collapses, and only the raw self remains. Panic is the psyche's protest against this revelation, for it would prefer the comfort of delusion to the nakedness of truth. But the empath, too, undergoes a crisis. In this awakening, to see the game is to realize how deeply one has colluded with it, not consciously, not willingly, but by the magnetic pull of unconscious archetypes. The empath realizes that they were not merely victim, but also participant, finding in the service of another a substitute for facing their own wounds. Here lies the paradox. The empath sought to heal in order to avoid confronting the unhealed places within themselves. Their compassion, while genuine, was also a strategy of the psyche to avoid solitude, abandonment, and the terror of their own darkness. When this becomes clear, it feels like betrayal by one's own soul. Yet, this is the moment of individuation, the turning point where consciousness deepens and the true self emerges. The process of individuation is never gentle. It is a tearing, a birth, an initiation. The empath, in this moment of revelation, is summoned into a new stage of psychic development. No longer the unconscious healer, they are asked to become the conscious alchemist, able to recognize projection and retrieve it, able to hold the tension between compassion and boundary, between openness and discernment. This is a painful transformation, for it requires the dismantling of the savior identity, but without this death, no rebirth is possible. To individuate is to step beyond archetypal possession into conscious dialogue with the archetypes, neither rejecting them nor surrendering to them fully, but engaging them as living powers within the psyche. The narcissist, in panic, may escalate their efforts to reclaim control. They may rage, manipulate, or seduce, for the game must continue at all costs. Here we see the archetype of the trickster in its darker form, desperate to maintain the spell. The empath must resist the temptation to return to sleep, to play once again the familiar role, for the psyche craves familiarity even when it is destructive. To awaken is to endure loneliness, the icy wind of detachment, the silence where once there was intoxicating drama, yet this silence is sacred. It is the threshold to the self, the deeper center of the psyche that transcends both empath and narcissist, both healer and devourer. If you listen closely in dreams, You will often find this drama symbolized. An individual may dream of a vampire feeding upon them, only to discover that the vampire cannot approach once the dreamer turns to face it. Or they may dream of a theater with masks being swapped endlessly until one mask falls away, revealing nothing beneath. Such dreams are the psyche's attempt to dramatize what is otherwise invisible in waking life. The unconscious seeks to awaken us through symbols because direct confrontation with truth is often too shattering. The empath's awakening is rarely sudden. It comes through whispers of intuition, images in dreams, fleeting feelings of unease. Only when the pressure of the unconscious becomes unbearable does the full recognition break through. There is also a collective dimension to this drama. We live in an age where the archetype of narcissism has taken root not merely in individuals but in cultures, systems, and institutions. Our society rewards appearance over essence, image over substance, performance over authenticity. In such a world, the empath, the one who feels deeply, who senses the suffering beneath the mask, is both necessary and endangered. When such individuals awaken, when they see through the collective game, their very presence becomes threatening to systems built on illusion. This is why empaths often feel alienated, dismissed, or even punished when they speak truth. They are not merely confronting an individual narcissist, but an entire archetypal current flowing through our civilization. Yet, the work of awakening cannot be abandoned. For every empath who sees the game and refuses to play, a spark of transformation enters the collective unconscious. Consciousness is contagious. Just as illusion can spread like a contagion, so too can awareness. When one soul reclaims their projection, it creates a ripple in the web of psyche, inviting others to do the same. This is why the narcissist panics, for they sense often unconsciously that their own carefully constructed world is under threat. To awaken one empath is to endanger the entire illusion, for the spell requires silence to sustain itself. A single voice of truth can unravel an empire of deception. I tell you this not to cast judgment upon the narcissist, for they too are prisoners of archetypes. Their panic is not mere malice, but the desperation of a soul drowning in its own unacknowledged shadow. If the empath awakens fully, there may come a time when they can see even the narcissist not as enemy but as wounded carrier of archetypal burden. Yet, such compassion must never be confused with surrender. True compassion includes boundary, for without boundary, compassion collapses into self-destruction. The awakened empath must hold both truths, that the narcissist is terrified child and dangerous predator, that their game is both survival mechanism and destructive force. To see with both eyes is a mark of maturity. Thus, the journey moves forward, wave after wave of recognition and resistance, grief and empowerment, loneliness and communion with the deeper self. The empath walks now not as victim but as pilgrim, guided by symbols, dreams, and inner voices And always the shadow waits not to destroy, but to be integrated. For in the end, the empath must recognize that the narcissist outside was always pointing toward the narcissist within. The part of the psyche that demands attention, control, and reflection. To individuate is to integrate even this, so that the inner tyrant becomes servant of the self, no longer an unconscious possessor, but a conscious ally in the alchemical work. The drama intensifies when the empath recognizes not only the mask of the narcissist, but the mask they themselves have been wearing. The realization dawns that their ceaseless giving, their boundless tolerance, their almost mystical attunement to others' needs was not born of pure virtue, but of a wound as ancient as their soul. The unconscious knows how to disguise necessity as devotion. What seemed like a calling to heal was often a refusal to encounter their own pain. It is here, in this raw exposure, that the empath faces the greatest temptation to recoil from the abyss and slip back into the familiar dance, or to stand firm and enter the unknown landscape of individuation. When you enter the unknown, you are stripped of your usual narratives. The empath, once certain that their role was savior, suddenly feels naked, uncertain, exposed. The world no longer arranges itself around their service. And this absence is both terrifying and liberating. To live without the constant game is to feel the strange silence of one's own soul. Many describe this stage as unbearable emptiness, but in truth it is the soil of rebirth. For when you cease feeding another's illusions, when you cease sacrificing yourself upon the altar of someone else's survival, you are left with the unmediated presence of your own shadow. This is why so many fall back. The silence is too much, the darkness too deep. But if you endure, you discover that the silence is not empty, but full, not void, but pregnant with the self. The narcissist, unable to endure such silence, clings all the more desperately to noise, to drama, to mirrors. Their panic is not only fear of exposure, but fear of death. For the narcissistic ego equates selfhood with performance. If the audience leaves, the play collapses, and the actor dissolves into nothingness. This nothingness is unbearable precisely because it is the shadow, the unloved, the rejected, the unlived life within. To confront it would require a death of identity, and so the narcissist lashes out, manipulates, pleads, or abandons anything but face the terrible mirror of truth. Yet their panic reveals the power of the empath's awakening. For the one who was once seen as weak, overly sensitive, too emotional, suddenly holds the key to the other's survival. The empath's withdrawal of collusion is like oxygen removed from a flame. The fire sputters, gasps, and rages, but do not mistake this for triumph. Awakening is not conquest, it is revelation. If the empath takes pride in having defeated the narcissist, they risk becoming ensnared once more by the very shadow they sought to escape. For to define oneself in opposition is still to be bound The true task is not victory, but integration, to recognize that the narcissist's shadow points to their own, and that the liberation of one cannot occur without the reconciliation of the other within the psyche. This is not to say that the empath must reconcile outwardly with the narcissist. Often the healthiest act is distance. Rather, it is to say that the empath must acknowledge the parts of themselves that sought validation in giving, that feared abandonment so deeply they tolerated betrayal, that mistook sacrifice for love. Only by owning this inner shadow can the empath truly step into wholeness. Think of a dream in which you are pursued by a predator. At first, you flee, terrified, heart pounding. But then, perhaps guided by some unseen wisdom, you turn and face the pursuer. To your astonishment, the predator transforms perhaps into a wounded child, perhaps into an animal that simply wanted to be acknowledged. Such is the logic of dreams, and such is the logic of the unconscious. What terrifies us most often contains the seed of our healing. The narcissist in outer life is the dramatization of the predator within, the unacknowledged hunger, the desperate demand to be seen and loved. When the empath faces this, not only in the other, but in themselves, the pursuit ends and the possibility of integration arises. This is why the path of the empath is both a curse and a gift. Their sensitivity exposes them to the games of others, but it also grants them the capacity to perceive archetypal dynamics that remain invisible to most. When they awaken, they do not merely heal themselves, they illuminate the collective shadow. Every empath who steps out of the game becomes a bearer of light for others still trapped. This light is not soft or sentimental. It is fierce, steady, uncompromising. It refuses to collude with illusion, and because it refuses, it calls others into the same silence, the same abyss, the same encounter with the self. The archetype of the wounded healer transforms here into the archetype of the alchemist. No longer content to pour their life into the bottomless vessel of another's need, the empath begins to transmute suffering into wisdom, shadow into gold. This process is not glamorous. It is often lonely, painful, slow. Dreams may bring images of fire, of crucibles, of metals melting and reforming. These are symbols of the inner work. The psyche's attempt to reveal that transformation requires dissolution before recomposition. The empath must allow the old identity to burn away so that a new one may be forged. And this new one is not an identity in the ordinary sense, but a connection to the self, that eternal center which holds all opposites in balance. Consider the myth of Persephone, drawn into the underworld against her will, forced to dwell among shadows and specters. At first she is victim, powerless, consumed by the dark, but as the myth unfolds, she becomes queen of the underworld, not by rejecting it, but by embracing her role within it. She emerges each year into the light, bringing spring, but she also returns to the depths, for she has integrated the two realms, This is the journey of the empath. To awaken is not to escape the underworld of manipulation and shadow, but to rule within it, to hold its power consciously, neither enslaved nor denying. The narcissist remains trapped precisely because they cannot accept the underworld. They fear it, project it, deny it. The empath, when conscious, becomes its master. This mastery does not mean control over others. It means sovereignty within one's own psyche. No longer must the empath absorb every pain, every projection, every need. They can discern what belongs to them and what does not. They can feel compassion without surrendering their soul. They can walk into the presence of shadow without being devoured, because they know the shadow within themselves. This sovereignty radiates outward, unsettling to those who depend on illusions, inspiring to those who seek truth. It is not loud. It does not need to announce itself. It is simply presence, a groundedness in the self that cannot be shaken by panic, rage, or seduction. Yet the path is never finished. To live as an awakened empath is to live in constant dialogue with the unconscious. The shadow will always return in new forms, new disguises. The archetypes do not vanish. They demand continual engagement. The narcissist may appear again, not in the same person, but in a new relationship, a new system, a new voice within. Each encounter is an invitation to deepen, to integrate further, to refine the alchemical gold. The work is lifelong, and it is holy. For in this work, the soul becomes whole. And in becoming whole, it contributes to the wholeness of humanity itself. I tell you, do not fear the panic of the narcissist. Do not fear their rage, their withdrawal, their desperate performances. These are but the tremors of a collapsing illusion. Fear instead the temptation to return to sleep, to trade your sovereignty for the comfort of old games. For once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Once you have awakened, you cannot pretend ignorance. To do so would be to betray the self, and the self does not forgive such betrayal lightly. It will call you again through dreams, through synchronicities, through suffering, until you answer. Better to walk willingly into the path of individuation than to be dragged by fate. And so I leave you with this vision: the empath standing alone, surrounded by silence, no longer feeding the illusions of another, no longer defined by sacrifice. In their hands, they hold the fragments of their old identity, broken but precious. Before them burns the fire of transformation, demanding surrender. Behind them echoes the panicked cries of the narcissist, desperate for the game to continue, and within them stirs the self, vast, eternal, unshakable, whispering, enter, trust, become. This is the moment of truth. This is the beginning of wholeness. And this, above all, is why the narcissist panics, because when one soul chooses truth over illusion, the entire architecture of deception trembles. The awakening of the empath is not a singular flash of lightning that leaves all things permanently illuminated. It comes in waves, often receding after it surges, demanding again and again that the soul learn to walk in this new light. Each time, the empath sees the game more clearly. The narcissist's panic deepens, but so too does the empath's struggle with loneliness. To awaken is to step out of a dream that many still inhabit, and when you awaken, you may find that the warmth of belonging vanishes, replaced with the cold air of truth. Yet in this solitude lies the seed of authenticity, for only in the silence can one hear the whisper of the self. The self is not the ego, nor the mask you show to the world. The self is the center of the psyche, eternal, encompassing both light and shadow. To approach it is to approach mystery itself. When the empath ceases to give away their life force, to sustain the fragile architecture of another's illusion, that energy returns inward, and the self begins to stir. At first, this feels like chaos, sudden dreams of fire, floods, or wild animals, an unexplainable flood of emotions, physical exhaustion, as if one is being undone. This undoing is necessary. The old psychic order must collapse before a new one can be born. The empath may weep as though grieving a death, and in truth they are the death of the old self, the death of the collusion, the death of unconscious servitude. The narcissist senses this death as abandonment, and abandonment to them is annihilation. Their panic becomes louder, more desperate. They may alternate between rage and pleading, between casting the empath as demon and angel in a frantic attempt to re-establish the old contract. But the awakened empath now sees the shifting masks for what they are. What once seduced now appears as performance. What once commanded fear now inspires pity. And here, in this moment, lies the greatest danger. The empath must resist the temptation of pity that lures them back into the old game. For pity is but compassion without boundary. And it is the hook through which the narcissist re-enters. True compassion does not rescue another from their own shadow. It stands firm and allows them to encounter it. Thus the empath must endure the guilt that arises when they refuse to play savior once more. Dreams at this stage often reveal the deeper struggle. One may dream of carrying a child that suddenly grows heavy, impossibly heavy, until the dreamer collapses. Or one may dream of being chained to a drowning figure, pulled under the water until the dreamer finally releases their grip. These are messages from the unconscious, dramatizations of the soul's conflict between the compulsion to save and the necessity to release. To interpret such dreams is to understand that saving the other often means destroying oneself, and that the true task is not to rescue, but to awaken. The empath must learn to release with love, even when the other calls it betrayal. The archetypal pattern is ancient. In myth, we see the motif of the hero who must descend into the underworld, not to rescue another, but to find themselves. Orpheus descend for Eurydice, but his inability to trust the unseen costs him her return. Perseus slays the Gorgon not by facing her directly, but by holding up a mirror, symbol of reflection and consciousness. These myths are not merely old tales, they are maps of the unconscious. The empath, too, must descend, must confront the Medusa of projection, must hold up the mirror of awareness. In doing so, they risk losing the one they sought to save, but they gain something greater, the power to see without turning to stone. It is often at this stage that the empath feels an almost unbearable grief. They grieve the relationship, yes, but more profoundly they grieve the illusion itself. The game, for all its pain, was also home. It provided structure, identity, and meaning. To leave it is to step into the wilderness with no guide, no map. This grief is necessary, for without it, the soul cannot detach fully. And in the depths of grief, one may feel abandoned not only by the other, but by life itself, by God, by meaning. Yet it is in this dark night of the soul that the self reveals itself, not as external savior, but as inner source. The empath learns to drink from their own well, to nourish themselves with the waters of the unconscious, rather than drawing endlessly from the poisoned stream of another's projection. The narcissist's panic, in contrast, is the panic of one who cannot drink from within. Their well is blocked, buried under layers of denial, shame, and fear. They have survived by siphoning from others, and when this source is cut off, their thirst becomes unbearable. Some will seek new victims quickly, others will collapse into despair. But all are confronted with the same reality. They cannot escape the shadow forever. The empath's withdrawal confronts them with their own emptiness. It is not cruelty that delivers this confrontation, but necessity. Only by facing the abyss might they find their own path to individuation. Though many will resist to the end, and here the empath faces yet another temptation, the temptation of superiority. To see the game is to feel a certain power, a certain clarity denied to those still asleep. But if the empath clings to this power, they risk becoming what they once opposed. For superiority is the shadow twin of awakening. True awakening does not elevate one above another. It humbles, for it reveals the universality of shadow. The empath must remember that they too once played the game, that they too were unconscious, that their awakening was gift as much as effort. To hold this humility is to remain in dialogue with the self, not to fall into inflation. Inflation is a subtle danger. It whispers, you are special, chosen, above. It masquerades as enlightenment, but is in truth another mask of the ego. When the empath succumbs to inflation, they may look down upon the narcissist with contempt, forgetting that the narcissist is also a soul caught in archetypal possession. They may seek to play guru, teacher, savior to others, spreading their awakening like doctrine. But awakening cannot be imposed. It must arise within. To attempt to force it is to return again to the same dynamic, only in a new costume. The true task is to live the awakening, to embody it silently, radiantly, without compulsion to convert. In this way, the empath becomes a living symbol, and symbols transform more deeply than words. The unconscious will test this humility through new encounters. The empath may meet another who embodies the same archetype, another narcissist dressed in new clothes. If they have truly integrated, they will recognize the pattern immediately and respond differently. If not, they may fall once more, though the fall will not be as deep, for some awareness will remain. This is how the psyche teaches. Not in one decisive victory, but in cycles of repetition, each offering the chance for deeper integration. To fail is not to regress, but to learn, provided the lesson is claimed. The narcissist's panic in these new encounters is often sharper, for the awakened empath does not provide the same nourishment, and the game collapses more swiftly. Over time, the empath learns that awakening is not about escaping suffering, but about transforming it. They come to see that their sensitivity, once a burden, is also their gift, for it allows them to perceive archetypal truth. But now they hold this gift differently. No longer is it poured out indiscriminately. It is guarded, treasured, offered with discernment. This discernment is not coldness, but wisdom. It is the wisdom of knowing that not all suffering can be healed, that not all shadows can be integrated in this lifetime, that to save another at the expense of oneself is not salvation but collusion. The empath learns to walk with open heart and firm boundary, a paradox that is the very essence of individuation. And so the game ends not with dramatic victory, not with final confrontation, but with quiet refusal. The empath no longer plays, and in their refusal, the game dissolves. The narcissist may rage, panic, flee, or collapse, but the spell is broken. The empath, standing in their own center, feels both the grief of endings and the serenity of freedom. They look back upon the past, not with bitterness, but with a strange gratitude, for without the game, they would never have awakened. The narcissist, the shadow, the archetype, all were teachers in disguise. To see this is to step beyond victim and rescuer alike, into the larger circle of the self. As the empath steps further into the mystery of their own awakening, the outer drama with the narcissist fades in importance. What once consumed every breath, every thought, now appears as the outer expression of an inner truth. The panic of the narcissist was never merely about them. It was the panic of the unintegrated shadow, terrified of exposure. And when the empath sees this clearly, they understand that the entire game was an initiation, a rite of passage into the deeper life of the soul, The soul's journey is not about comfort. It is about wholeness, and wholeness demands that we face what we have long denied. The empath had denied their need for boundaries, denied their own hunger for love, denied the rage buried within them. They covered these denials with endless giving, with self-sacrifice, with saintly masks. The narcissist, like an uninvited teacher, forced these denials into the open by demanding more and more, by consuming without end. The narcissist revealed the truth that the empath too had a shadow, a place within crying out for recognition. In this way, even in their destructiveness, the narcissist served the archetype of awakening. It is a terrible gift, but a gift nonetheless. Dreams in this stage may become luminous, filled with images of integration. The dreamer may see themselves walking through a forest at night, only to find the moon illuminating the path, or they may meet figures once threatening who now offer guidance, revealing treasures hidden in the dark. These are signs that the unconscious recognizes the work, that the archetypes have shifted from possession to dialogue. The empath no longer flees from the shadow, nor is devoured by it. They stand in relation to it, learning, conversing, transmuting. This is the essence of individuation. The ego in dialogue with the unconscious, guided by the self, weaving a new wholeness from fragments once torn apart. The narcissist, if they too ever awaken, must undergo a similar process, but their path is even more perilous, for they have built their house upon mirrors. To tear down those mirrors feels like death itself. And yet, as I have said, the path of wholeness is death before it is life. Unless the narcissist endures this psychic death, unless they consent to be shattered, they cannot find rebirth. The empath, in their awakening, cannot take them by the hand and walk this path for them. They may wish to, but to attempt it is to re-enter the game. The narcissist's panic is their own initiation, and it belongs to them alone. The empath's task is to bear witness without surrender, to hold space without being consumed. This is the great paradox of love. To love truly is not to merge, not to lose oneself in another, but to stand as whole before the other, offering presence without sacrifice of essence. The empath, once trapped in the compulsion to save, now learns this deeper love. It is a love that honors boundaries, that recognizes the autonomy of the soul, that does not confuse pity with compassion. It is a love that sees clearly, without illusion, without projection, and in this clarity, the empath discovers that love is not diminished, but made sacred. For love that is born of wholeness is not conditional, not disparity, not manipulative. It is the radiance of the self shining through the finite vessel of the human heart. The archetypal figures shift accordingly. The wounded healer, once bound to the suffering of others, becomes the conscious alchemist, capable of transforming pain into wisdom. The devouring shadow, once projected outward onto the narcissist, is now recognized and integrated, its energy harnessed rather than feared. The trickster, once enemy, becomes ally, teaching through paradox and reversal. The underworld, once feared, becomes home to mystery and depth. In this way, the psyche moves from chaos to order, from possession to dialogue, from fragmentation to wholeness. And what of the empath's sensitivity, that very trait that drew them into the game? It does not vanish. It is not dulled. Rather, it becomes refined, honed, guided. The empath learns to direct it with discernment, to sense not only the pain of others, but also their manipulations, their projections, their shadows. This discernment allows them to choose where to invest their energy, where to draw back, where to engage, where to refuse. Sensitivity, once weakness, becomes wisdom. It is no longer an open wound, but a finely tuned instrument, capable of perceiving the music of the unconscious. And when guided by the self, this sensitivity becomes a gift, not only for survival, but for creation. For the awakened empath does not stop at healing themselves. They become creators. Out of their wholeness flows art, vision, insight, presence that nourishes others without draining themselves. They embody what I have long called the individuation process, the becoming of the one you truly are, beyond masks, beyond roles, beyond archetypal possession. This individuation is not for themselves alone. Each individuated soul contributes to the collective, planting seeds of consciousness in the soil of humanity. The empath, by seeing the game and refusing it, helps all of us awaken from the larger illusion, the collective narcissism of a culture addicted to mirrors. Yes, our culture too is a narcissist. Panicking as the sensitive awaken, it thrives on performance, on endless validation, on the consumption of life for image. And so, as empaths awaken, the culture trembles. For every soul that refuses the game is one less participant in the grand illusion. This is why the work is not merely personal, but cosmic. To awaken as an empath is to become a warrior of the self, a bearer of truth in a world of appearances. And though the path is lonely, though the narcissist panics and the culture resists, the deeper truth remains. Consciousness cannot be stopped. Once seen, it spreads like light through cracks, like dawn through darkness. The final stage of this journey is integration. The empath no longer defines themselves as empath, nor as victim, nor even as healer. They become simply human whole, flawed, luminous, shadowed, alive. They carry within them all the archetypes, not as tyrants, but as companions. They can descend into the underworld without fear, for they know the way out. They can face the shadow without trembling, for they have embraced it within. They can love without losing themselves, for they have found themselves in the depths, and in this state they no longer fear the narcissist's panic, nor resent it, nor pity it. They see it for what it is, the soul's desperate cry for wholeness, the shadow's terror of the light. And so the lecture ends where it began, with the moment of seeing. When the empath finally sees the game, when they refuse to collude, when they stand in their own center, the narcissist panics, but this panic is not the end of the story. It is the beginning, for in that moment, two souls stand at the threshold, one stepping into wholeness, the other confronted with the choice of awakening or deeper illusion. The empath cannot choose for the narcissist, but they can choose for themselves, and in choosing, they shift the balance of the archetypes within the collective. They become not victim, not savior, but symbol, a living testament to the power of consciousness, to dissolve illusion and reveal truth. Remember this. The unconscious does not punish, it educates. The narcissist was your teacher, as you were theirs. The panic was the lesson, as was the silence that followed. The game was the stage, the archetypes, the actors, the self, the director, and you, the empath, are now invited to take your place, not as pawn in the game, but as conscious participant in the mystery of life. The shadow remains. Yes, the archetypes remain. The struggles will return, but you are no longer blind. You are no longer bound. You have seen, and what is seen cannot be unseen. Thus, the lecture closes, not with resolution, but with invitation to live what you have seen, to embody the wholeness glimpsed in shadow and light, to carry the flame of consciousness into a world that still dreams. The narcissist will panic. Yes, the culture will resist. Even parts of your own psyche will tremble at the enormity of this vision. But the self is greater than fear, and the journey of individuation is eternal. Walk it, and you walk not only for yourself, but for all who long for awakening. For when one empath sees, the light spreads, and no game, however ancient, can survive forever against the truth